accepts that he's not going to be king, but he asks for Abishag, the hot chick, the Shunammite, right? The otherwise known as David's hot water bottle, who had been keeping him warm as an old man in his bed, and gone to Bathsheba to ask Bathsheba to go to Solomon to ask for this wife, and so that didn't go over real well, right? So we have her right here, set her on her own throne, on her seat, making a request for you. Solomon's answer is verse 22. He answered and said to his mother, "Why are you asking Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him also the kingdom, for he is my older brother, even for him, for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah." So you have this kind of trinity of small t trinity, this trinity of disloyalty in Solomon's mind. He's like, why are you asking for favor for people who tried to oust me from my proper space, my proper spot and office in the country? So King Solomon swore by Yahweh, saying, "May God do so to me, and more also, if Adonijah has not spoken this word against his own life." So this is the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? So now therefore, as Yahweh lives, who has established me and set me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house as he promised, surely Adonijah shall be put to death today. So King Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he fell upon him so that he died. And Abiathar the priest, king said, "Go to Anathoth to your own field, for you deserve to die, but I will not put you to death at this time, because you carried the ark of Yahweh Elohim, Lord God, before my father David, and because you were afflicted in everything with which my father was afflicted." So Solomon dismissed Abiathar from being priest to Yahweh in order to fulfill the word of Yahweh which he had spoken concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. Eli, by the way, is different than Elijah. Are you Eli or Elijah? Elijah. My brother's Elijah. We call him Eli, or all sorts of various and sundry nicknames centered around Eli. But Eli and Elijah obviously, right, are different people. Elijah is a prophet. Elisha is a prophet. Eli was a priest, remember, and he was a terrible father, apparently, who failed greatly, was struck dead. His two sons were struck dead, and he was essentially renounced from the priesthood, and his line was renounced from the priesthood. So it's like the anti-covenant, right? You want, there are various forms, like with Phineas, right? Phineas has a personal, unconditional covenant in perpetuity that his family would be in the line of priests because of his faithfulness. The same can be true. You can be excluded from a line of promise because of your behavior, and you can exclude your entire line from service, from opportunities. Same thing happened with Saul, if we're to be clear. Although Saul was just denied, he was denied an unconditional covenant. So God didn't say no one will ever rule on your throne ever again. He simply deposed him, and then at first, and then excluded any of his descendants afterwards. Those are two separate actions. Anyway, so that he says, the writer here of First Kings says that this is what was to fulfill that, right? Remember that First Kings is part of the prophetic canon, and so they'll stop and make note of certain prophetically significant issues more than in some of the historical narrative, and that's one of them, right? That the priesthood would be consolidated. So Solomon is taking some fairly severe action, right? It is necessary, right? Everybody, I don't know if it's a graduation. We were just talking about people who are in the bureaucracy of the previous administration that ought to be in prison. That may be even too soft for some of them. I think somebody like Dr. Fauci ought to be executed for all the death that he caused, not just going to prison. We would consider that a war criminal if it had been in another country. But it was normal. It was normal for a king to execute people when he was brought into his office. Now we just let them resign, and you never hear from them again. who was Eric Holder, another one, disappeared off the face of the map, would be an absolute war criminal anywhere else. If he was a citizen of any other country, you would never see the light of day again. He'd be shackled under a bed somewhere and forgotten, let to rot and die. So anyway, it's nice that we don't kill him anymore, usually. But this was normal. So it was a gracious act on his part that he allowed Abiathar to retire, rather because he is part of this trinity of disloyalty to the Davidic line, which is not something that was guaranteed or required. Now, Joab's a weird case because he's next, right? So Joab has done many courageous things. He was in charge of David's army before he was king over the whole country. There's a big hole right in the middle of this room. I feel like I'm looking all the way to my left and all the way to my right. So y'all just are going to have to suffer. I'm going to look at the empty hole. So Joab was not it's not that funny, guys. It's actually really weird. Anyway, so thanks for that. Anyway, Joab was mixed issue, right? Because he saved the country many times over and above what David had commanded him to do. But David held this personal issue with him for a long time, that despite his service to the country, despite what he bravely and courageously did on behalf of the nation, David never acknowledged that what he told him to do may have been foolish. And when he killed these two men, it's Abner and Amasa, I think, that may have also been service to the country on his part. But it was disobedience to the king, right? So we talk about that in our own day, right? That a patriot loves his country all the time and loves his government when they deserve it. Loves the country all the time and loves the government when they deserve it. I'm going to give you a little hint. Your government never deserves it. Your government never deserves it. Your country always deserves it. Love, that is. I'm not saying you don't follow the law, but I'm saying you don't have a love for them necessarily. So David, remember, told Solomon, Joab is one of the guys you're going to have to deal with. You're not going to let him die a natural death. That can't happen because he has committed personal disloyalty to our line. Whether it was good for the country or not was not an issue for David. I think we can make an argument politically that Joab acted rightly, but he's still going to suffer because of it. And that's a category we have to allow, that we may serve the greater good. We may do so righteously. We may do so biblically. We may serve the Lord in ways that are not recognized by other servants of the Lord in the earth that have authority over us, right? That is a category. So that is my opinion of what's happening here, right? The personal disloyalty of Joab is not going to be forgiven. So they make this case, right? The news came to Joab, verse 28, for Joab had followed Adonijah, which was a problem. This is starting well and ending badly. We can talk about that character also, although he had not followed Absalom, right? So we remember that long story. Joab fled to the tent of Yahweh, which was the tabernacle, as far as I understand it, and took hold of the horns of the altar. So everybody does this. The good guys, the bad guys, everybody seeking propitiation, mercy, atonement, whatever. This is where all the cool kids go when they need mercy, right? And it was told King Solomon that Joab had fled to the tent of Yahweh, and behold, he is beside the altar. Then Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, saying, go fall upon him. And so Benaiah came to the tent of Yahweh and said to him, thus the king has said, come out. But he said, no, for I will die here. And Benaiah brought the king word again, saying, thus spoke Joab, and thus he answered me. So the king said to him, do as he has spoken, and fall upon him, and bury him, that you may remove from me and my father's house the blood which Joab shed without cause. Yahweh will return his blood on his own head, because he fell upon two men more righteous and better than he, and killed them with the sword, while my father David did not know it. Abner the son of Ner, commander of the army of Israel, and Amasa the son of Jether, commander of the army of Judah. So shall their blood return on the head of Joab and on the head of his descendants forever. But to David and his descendants and his house and his throne may there be peace from Yahweh forever. So honestly, I think Solomon is looking for a warrant that he doesn't need, right? He doesn't actually need all of this warrant. He doesn't have to make this statement, but this is the offense. The offense is that he killed these two guys, and that was disloyalty to the line and their understanding because they were disobedient to the line. But he doesn't need that, right? He only needs that he followed Adonijah. That's it. That's all he needs. That's the simple only warrant that he does need in this situation, and could have just said that, but he goes off on this sermon, right? That is going to bring blood guilt on his line and on his descendants, and he compares it, right? That this is going to be it's a prophecy in a sense, right? So shall their blood return on the head of Joab and on the head of his descendants forever. But to David and his descendants and his house and his throne may there be peace from the Lord forever. So that's his discussion, right? This is what's going to happen. He does see himself as the arm, the hand of God coming down on Joab and his family, his descendants, and that this is going to be a permanent effect on his family. And that's what he's intending to do, right? So he does that. Benaiah the son of Jehoiada went up and fell upon him and put him to death, and he is buried at his own house in the wilderness. Even hanging onto the horns didn't help him in this case, right? So this is personal disloyalty has a price, unfortunately. There are times where you have to do. We don't kill them generally. I'm not against killing people that need to be killed, right? But it happens probably only 6 or 8 times since I've been the pastor here. I have to essentially tell people, listen, I'm sure that the Lord has somewhere for you to serve, but it's not here. You have to leave. You have to leave. And it's just how it goes. It has to happen sometimes. If I can't trust somebody to do what they need to do, I can't trust them to not be problematic or factious or divisive. We do our best essentially to erase their memory and their issues and their problems from this church, quite frankly. Again, that's not a death sentence, although I do feel like I ought to warn any church that they go to when it gets that bad. You can get into trouble for doing things like that, but I probably ought to warn people, I feel like, when they leave. And unfortunately, there's so many churches they could possibly go to that I don't have enough time to go chase all the ones they're going and messing around in. But it happens, right? So that personal and corporate disloyalty has a price that has to be paid sometimes. So Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, fell upon him. We read verse 34. Verse 35, the king appointed Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, over the army in his place, and the king appointed Zadok the priest in the place of Abiathar. Right? So remember that name, Zadok. Occasionally when you're reading decent commentaries, you will hear a reference to the Zadokite priesthood. That is every time there's a consolidation, right? So Moses, in a sense, served alongside of Aaron as a priest. You see them functioning. There was not the discrimination between the offices of prophet and priest. Moses held both, and he serves, and he sprinkles blood, and he does things, and then Aaron consolidates, functions as the high priest when the law is more solidified, and then you have it consolidated down to Levi. Then you have it consolidated down to Phinehas's line for the high priest. And then you have exclusions like Eli. Well, Eli's not going to do that. So very legitimately, you have to be able to recognize that there are consolidations of the line that are fulfillments, right? So this matters, right? Then when we understand how God is going to keep his perpetual covenants and exclude people based on contingent covenants. We talked about that Last time, when we made the distinction, right, between what David tells Solomon and what God tells David. God tells David that there will be a righteous heir that will sit on the throne forever. And David tells Solomon, God revealed to me also that as long as I have an heir that is obedient, that there's going to be no gap between my rule and that one righteous guy. But they didn't do that. Right? Those are not the same covenant. One covenant was perpetual, eternal, unconditional, and non-contingent. The other one was something separate. It's just the application of the Mosaic law of the greatest commandment to their lives of that particular line. And so they don't do that. So we need to keep those two things separate. So this is how God is choosing to keep the perpetual covenant that he made to Aaron and to Phinehas later, while still excluding people that were also perpetual negative covenants. He's absolutely faithful to keep every single promise that he makes. And so when you don't conflate them, you don't create problems. And this is in the bigger picture, this is an issue, right? In the big picture, this is why we're dispensationalists. This is why we understand with many other dispensationalists, right, that when Israel is Israel, Israel is not the church. The church is not Israel. Israel is not the church. They don't overlap. People who say otherwise are people who conflate conditional covenants and unconditional covenants. Israel has an absolute unconditional covenant, right? It was made with Abraham. Absolutely no conditions applied to it. God will bring the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, into their full blessing. The land seed, the blessing forever, under the righteous ruler forever, period, absolutely, no question, and that's not us. And the people who say that it is us are saying that an unconditional covenant actually can change parties, right? So that would be like me saying, signing a contract to sell a piece of property at a certain price, right? And I then change the person on the contract, and everything else is the same. All of the other things are the same, but I sell it to a wholly different person and say, look, I kept my promise to you over there. Well, I didn't keep my promise to them. Simply because the contract is the same, I offered a contract to this person over here that was identical. But changing the party to the contract is entirely, it mutilates and changes the contract entirely. So you can't sit the church in there. The problem is that the church gets some blessings that were promised to Israel, don't we? And in fact, we get some that were not promised to Israel in a way, right? We actually get some superior blessings. Israel was promised, in my understanding, to be filled with the Spirit, right? You have that aspect in the prophets. They were not necessarily promised to be permanently indwelt by the Spirit. A lot of people say that having the law written on their hearts is an indwelling by the Spirit, but that's a big stretch. That's a huge stretch to say that that's the indwelling of the Spirit, because you have an indwelling of the Spirit, don't you? Well, why do you come to Sunday school? And why do I bother teaching it? Because the indwelling of the Spirit doesn't mean that you have the law written, you don't have God's word written on your heart. You don't. That's not a benefit of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So anyway, but sameness or similarity does not mean sameness. The fact that God gives some blessings of the same blessings to different people does not mean that the people are the same. Right? Right? Okay. Need to agree on this one, because otherwise you'll be wrong. And you don't want to be wrong. You want to be right, right? Right. We all want to be right. Val wants to be right. The rest of y'all don't care. All right. Good job, Val. We want you to be right too. You just need to agree with me on this point, and then you're in good standing. All right. So Zadok, right? This is how God is keeping and disambiguating all of his conditional and unconditional covenants. So the king sent and called for Shimei. You remember this guy? He's the one who came out and cursed David for deposing Saul, right? And actually just told everybody we need to go. Essentially, we need to go back to the time of the judges, right? We just need to forget the monarchy. These guys are idiots, and we need to go back to doing what is right in our own eyes, right? So the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, build for yourself a house in Jerusalem and live there, and do not go out from there to any place. Now that may sound pretty lenient, but it's essentially house arrest. Turned Jerusalem into a city of refuge, right? You remember the principles of the city of refuge. If you were guilty of manslaughter and you were being righteously chased, pursued by a family member who's going to exact vengeance on you, you could go to the city of refuge and hide there essentially until the high priest died and was replaced. Then you were free to go. But as long as that high priest lived, the one over currently in his office, was 50 years, 10 years, 5 years, 5 months, it didn't matter. Once he died, you were free to go. This is more of a life incarceration. It was not a terrible thing to be in Jerusalem as far as prisons go, but it was imprisoning him there. It tells him, for on the day you go out and cross over the brook Kidron, you will know for certain that you shall surely die, and your blood shall be on your own head. So Shimei then said to the king, the word is good. As my lord the king has said, so your servant will do. So Shimei lived in Jerusalem many days. But it came about at the end of 3 years that 2 of the servants of Shimei ran away to Achish, son of Maacah, king of Gath. And they told Shimei, saying, behold, your servants are in Gath. Well, I would, a reasonable person says the 2 servants aren't worth my life, but that's not what happened, right? So Shimei arose, saddled his donkey, went to Gath, to Achish, to look for his servants, and Shimei went and brought his servants from Gath. Slaves, servants, important people to him. And it was told Solomon that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had returned. So Gath, right, that's under Philistine occupation generally. This was Goliath's hometown. Lord knows what they were doing. I don't know what they were doing there. It doesn't say why they would have gone there, but generally speaking, Samson went there for dishonorable reasons, right? Went and hung around the Philistines. Maybe he was trying to, I don't know, maybe he was trying to take care of them, I guess, and do what was best. Thought there might have been an exception in order to do that. Told Solomon that he had done it, though, and had returned. So the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, did I not make you swear by Yahweh and solemnly warn you, saying, you will know for certain that on the day you depart and go anywhere, you shall surely die? And you said to me, the word which I have heard is good. Why then have you not kept the oath of Yahweh and the command which I have laid on you? And the king also said to Shimei, you know all the evil which you acknowledge in your heart, which you did to my father David. Therefore Yahweh shall return evil on your own head. But King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before Yahweh forever. So the king commanded Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he went out and fell upon him, so that he died. Thus the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon. So there's, these executions. I guess Abiathar was not an execution. That was a banishment. But removals of threats, right, to the Solomonic rule, the Davidic dynasty. There are some interesting facets here, right? We talk about this quite frequently, or at least I do, in that the people are not, under the Mosaic law, are not to be put to death for the sins of their fathers. Scripture is fairly clear that you can punish a family line for the sins of the fathers. You can do that. That is a legitimate, lawful thing to do. More than that, it says that a father can ruin generations of his own line and bring discipline and consequences on his line, but you're not allowed to exercise capital punishment. In other words, if your daddy killed somebody, you're not allowed to put the son to death, which was common practice in the ancient Near East. However, the reverse is not true. It is righteous for the son of the king to execute an enemy of his father, right? That was his actual sin that he committed, and he committed it years ago. It doesn't expire. Your guilt does not expire, especially when it's a crime committed against the Davidic dynasty. And so we shouldn't confuse the two. Occasionally you'll see a commentary that confuses these things. Simply because his father died, but his aggressor did not, does not mean that he wasn't guilty before the law. And should be granted amnesty or something like that. So Solomon acts aggressively, and ultimately ends up doing what his father told him to do, to consolidate his rule. He understood the risks. Generally speaking, I think that probably David was just too feeble at some point in his rule in order to deal with these things. These are things that you really shouldn't pass on to the next guy, right? So I'll just, we're not Israel, and I'm not a king, but that is when I tell somebody, listen, the Lord has something for you to do in this world, but it's not here anymore, which is literally the way that I say it generally. One of the primary thoughts is that I could die tomorrow, and what kind of crap am I leaving for the next guy to deal with, right? What kind of crap am I leaving anybody else to deal with? What kind of problems am I letting fester? And I'll say, in general, I have regretted not acting aggressively enough, more than I have regretted acting aggressively on things like that. So don't live a life with regrets, right? You need to be gracious as much as possible when it's time to be aggressive as needs to be done. It took me a long time to come to that, right? Because I don't know if your mama probably always told you to be nice, right? That's a load of crap. Jesus never told you to be nice. My mother didn't know what she was talking about, quite frankly. And I think she understood that later in life, that she needed to be more aggressive in terms of dealing with relationship issues, certainly. Anyway, but that does, right, the theological justification right here is that the corporate body of believers on the earth at any time, which we don't have to confuse Israel and the church to say that the church is the corporate body of believers identified on the earth today that God is primarily using as his ministers and delegates, right? We're what the old dispensationalists would call a parenthesis, right? We are unrevealed, a mystery, but that is who we are, right? And that requires decisive and occasionally aggressive leadership to preserve the purity, unity, and righteousness of that body. And Solomon did that. And this is before he asked for wisdom. You like that? He hasn't had that encounter yet. He hasn't asked for wisdom. He was simply being obedient to his father's directions and the requirements of his office, which means that you guys can do that too, right? You can be appropriately aggressive in the leadership that God has given you. You do not have to be Solomon the wise to act wisely, right? A lot of times we end up being weak. Weak, that's good. Weak, and we want to try to sound like we're being strong, right? We say, well, I need to pray about this some more. No, you don't, usually. You usually do not need to pray about it more. You usually need to grow a spine and do what God has told you to do, and you already know what it is, and you're looking for an excuse, right? That, generally speaking, that is what has created the state of masculinity in the church in the United States and Western civilization, in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying that prayer isn't important, because there are certain things certainly that come up that you have no idea what you're doing. Have no idea how to resolve it, but I'll say that that's probably less than 5% of the major decisions you'll make in your life. So, anyway, Solomon formed a marriage alliance here, chapter 3. Any questions or comments about chapter 2? It's an authoritative narrative, right? Solomon acted righteously to deal with his enemies that were a direct, immediate threat to his dynasty. He acted righteously. The kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon, which is indicative of God's blessing, right, on his actions. It's not explicitly stated, right, but when the kingdom is firmly established, it's because God is blessing it, right? We can say that, absolutely, right? Because when God is not blessing it, what happens? The kingdom doesn't exist. It's not just unfirmly established. It starts to move into exile. And they're removed from the land, and the curses in those latter chapters of Deuteronomy are enacted. And everybody has to start looking again for the one righteous ruler, the fulfillment of all of the blessings that are to come. Remember that Moses prophesied, you'll experience all the blessings of the covenant, you'll experience all the curses of the covenant, and after you've experienced both the blessings and the curses in their fullness, After all of that, then the one kingdom will come. Then the permanent possession of land, seed, blessing will be forever, and the righteous one will rule over you. And so that it was established in his day is indicative that Solomon has fulfilled the righteous requirement that was revealed to him by David. That as long as they did follow his statutes and were faithful to God, that he would establish their kingdom in their lifetime. So, chapter 3, Solomon formed a marriage alliance with the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of Yahweh and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of Yahweh until those days. That doesn't mean that they were sacrificing to pagan gods. I mean, necessarily that they were engaging in idolatry, but they likely were. The high places were things that were to be torn down. That causative thing, right, can be problematic, right? So the writer tells us, right, because there was no temple, there was no accommodation for the corporate worship. There was some ambiguity about which God was in charge, right? They could have been. We read about people like Job. We read about other people who simply offered free will offerings and sacrifices in their best possible intent and sincerity, where there was no priesthood involved. It was not. It was not the normative thing, though, when the priesthood existed, when there was a high priest. But it would be difficult, right, to coalesce around a religion that didn't have a central place. So Solomon loved Yahweh, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. That seems to be that he was that was an exception, right? So whether everybody else was sacrificing to idols and to the Baals and whatever else on those high places, Solomon very clearly is offering and sacrificing improperly, right? So we have evidence, right? The kings weren't supposed to do this. The kings were not supposed to offer sacrifices to God. They were not. Well, how do we know that? For sure. Like, what's the example, the primary example? Anybody? Saul? Yeah, the big one. Offered sacrifices to Yahweh and lost his crown, right? So we could ask the question, what if everybody whose butt is in the seat between David and the righteous king has a conditional covenant, right? Everybody. So Solomon included. His occupancy of the throne is conditioned on his obedience to Yahweh. Why does he get to stay? And Saul didn't get to stay. And there's a simple answer to that, but I want to ask you with that question. So why does Solomon get to stay? And Saul lost not only his throne, but his dynasty after that point. No, because it's a conditional covenant. Sarah, remember? Your butt doesn't get to stay in the seat unless you're obedient in your lifetime. So why does Solomon's butt get to stay in the seat if you can't offer sacrifices to Yahweh as the king? And Solomon offered sacrifices. Anybody? No? Anybody know? Pastor wife, do you know? Val, do you know? Well, he's disobedient. That's why he should be removed, I think, at face value. What's the difference?
Well, I guess they were all told directly, but.
What?
Well, like in Saul was like told to wait for Samuel specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you would think this was still direction.
No, maybe. I don't think that's it. I don't think that's the solution. Who? So it's important that we understand this is an exception in Solomon's life. Who is Solomon offering the sacrifices to?
It's the Lord.
No, it says he loved the Lord, walking in the statute of his father David. The exception is that he offers sacrifice and burnt incense on the high places. Who's he burning incense and offering? Because both of these things are not supposed to be king stuff. In the temple, this will get you ridden out on a rail and, metaphorically burned at the stake. If you're the king, you're not supposed to do it. So who's he offering sacrifices to? Is he offering sacrifices to Yahweh? Doesn't look like it to me. What is the king prohibited from doing? What cost Saul his throne? Was offering sacrifices to the one holy and true almighty God of Israel, Yahweh, and taking the role of the priest before Yahweh. Right? That was the killer. That was the kicker that caused Saul to lose his throne and his dynasty to be deposed. Solomon is not doing that. Solomon is not doing that. So why is that important? Because it is important what we view, how we view somebody's faithfulness to the Lord, right? We would view this as a large sin, would we not? Right? Going up on the high places, this would be, I'm trying to come up with a good corollary. I joke that I get calls in the office. Well, actually, it's not a joke. I get more calls in the office from randos that want me to come drive demons out of their bathroom than anything else. I get that more than I get asked for money, which is saying something. People want me to come. I don't know what they think I do for a living, but I think it looks more like the Santeria religion, right? Have you heard of this? The Caribbean Roman Catholicism, syncretism. They go in and light up. It looks like, the Apaches burning sage over here, and then they're slaughtering a chicken on the coffee table and letting it flap around, and they're smoking the whole house and all this crap going on to drive out demons. I think they think that's what I do for a living, or at least on the side, as a side hustle. Probably safer doing that than moving bees around, because there's no real demons in the house. They just need an air freshener usually. You know what I'm saying? No matter what you had for lunch, it's no demon. It's just, a bathroom. Those are big sins, right? If you're engaging and worshiping and acknowledging demonic authority when it's not there, those are sins. I don't know. We probably don't have a direct analog to it. But how is it possible, right? David was a man after God's own heart, right? And yet he murdered Uriah. He did all sorts of things. He was negligent, almost criminally negligent in his later years in his life. And yet his unconditional covenant was not there, was not removed, because it's unconditional, for one thing. The issue here, right, is how God views somebody's weakness, right? God knows that person better than he knows himself. And he chose in his inspired word to say that Solomon loved Yahweh despite his failings, despite his weaknesses. And he never made the error that Saul made. But it was serious, right? The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there for what that was the great high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. This is not a normal pattern for the worship of Yahweh, that the king would offer that many sacrifices. That's got to be a pagan sacrifice. You don't just offer 1,000 things just for grins, right? And so here, right, despite being in his weakness, we got 3 minutes, so we're going to have to talk about this some more next week. Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what you wish me to give you." So here he is offering 1,000 something or others on an altar in Gibeon on a great high place. My opinion is that he's in the throes of one of the highest, greatest examples of his weakness and failings. And yet he loves Yahweh, and Yahweh appears to him in a dream at night. What I would consider to date, according to this revelation, his lowest spiritual point in his life. And that's when God says, I have given you an unconditional covenant. What's the matter, wife? You're looking like it. I'm missing something. No? Anybody else? Did I miss something? You have a question?
Where's the tabernacle in all this? If he's going to the high place.
Yeah. Well, the tabernacle, we know that the tabernacle exists, right? Because it was in the tent of the Lord, and it seems like it was in Jerusalem, right? But it was apparently not the cultic center that it was supposed to be. It was seen basically as the house of the Ark of the Covenant. And so, kind of Yahweh's office among the people, I guess. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you didn't go there unless you needed to go to the principal's office, or you needed to cast yourself on the horns of the altar that were there in the tent of the Lord. So I don't know, but I would suggest that you wouldn't go to the tabernacle and offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar to try to worship Yahweh in the tabernacle. Those kinds of sacrifices weren't done there. And that's not what the high places were. The high places were the things that they were supposed to tear down. Remember that it's not just the Asherah pole on the high place. There was some structure there, in addition to what was called the Asherah poles as well. The altars were the high places, and they built. You'll remember way back this kind of altar. This was, but originally in the Exodus, Israel was told when you built an altar, you're supposed to build an altar of modest size of uncut stone. It's not supposed to have stairs because I don't want to see your under regions. God literally tells them that. I don't want to see your nether regions as you go up the stairs to my altar. I want you to make it a small of uncut stone. But the ancient, y'all can go check me now, Aurora. They didn't wear underwear back then. That's how it was. God said, I don't want to see that. Literally, that was there. Y'all can go see it. And if you need it translated in the Josh Meyer Hillbilly translation, I can do that for you. But that's what it says. I don't want to see your undergarments or under areas. But ancient Near Eastern altars were huge. I mean, that's what the ziggurats are. That was kind of, and ziggurats were not unique to the South America. Originally, pyramids were like that. The big, huge high places. They're not joking when they call them high places. So they still existed, right? Or King says they still existed. And so remember that the intermarriage, the political issue, they weren't rid of all the people who lived in the country. They didn't even exterminate the 7 nations that they were supposed to exterminate. They still have people running off to Gath for the nightlife. I don't know why they went. The servants were like, well, we want to go to Gath. Maybe like, I don't know, 6th Street in Austin. I don't know. You know what I mean? I don't know why they went to Gath, but they did. That influence was still there, and there were political realities that were still there. And Solomon ruled over people who were not a part of the cultic observance. And I don't use that term in worshiping of demons, but like the religious establishment. And so he had a political reality that he had subjects that he was ruling over that were not of his religion. And so I think that's what we see here, that he is acknowledging, as any politician is, right? If Joe Biden is Catholic and Donald Trump is a Christian, we have to acknowledge that people do things religiously for political reasons, right? Joe Biden's no more Catholic than the current Pope is. But he acknowledges that he's Catholic. I mean, like, neither one of them are real Catholic as far as I can tell. And I come from a long line of observant Catholics on one side of my family, so I know the difference. They were good people who loved the Lord as best as they thought they could, and generally, and raised good families, and did the best that they thought they could do. And certainly didn't support abortion. Or we're not absolute pluralists, but we're over time here. Anyway, so I think what we have is him bowing to political reality, and God is offering a remedy, right? He says Solomon has this weakness. He is not able to stand in the political pressures of ruling over people that don't share his religion. And that's why he offers him anything he asks for the sake of the people. Anything you ask for, I'll give to you. I will give it to you because you love the Lord and you have this rather large blind spot here, and we need to resolve this for the sake of the people. But we'll talk about that some more next week. Does that make some sense where we're going with that? Now, this is a failing, right? This is a failing of Solomon that God is trying to address. All right. Okay. Questions, comments, accusations of heresy?
Real quick,
Yes.
Joab threw himself on the horns of the altar.
Yes.
I assume in the tabernacle.
Yep.
Was there ever any prohibition of that you couldn't grab somebody that had put themselves on the altar for mercy?
I don't think so.
I don't
No.
remember any.
No. I think it was a bit of theatrics in a way. Like the old westerns where people would run into the local church and literally throw themselves on the tabernacle or whatever and hold on to it. And this is a holy place. You can't shoot me here. You know what I mean? There's actually no prohibition against that. It was just their best shot. Yeah. No, they're not to my knowledge. It may have been customary, but I mean, there were places. So Joab, for instance, guys, let me pray, and I'll answer this question in a minute. Not on the video. Father, we thank you for this day. We do thank you for your word. We thank you for this record, the prophetic word regarding the Davidic dynasty here in Kings. And we thank you that it was preserved for us and that it is profitable for us. And we thank you for it. We love you for the life that we have in your Son by grace.